A great first project for beginning sewers is to create a quilt square. And in quilting, we're often cutting rectangles and squares and placing them together in straight lines. And that's what makes it a great exercise for beginning stitchers, because you want to practice how to put pieces together in a particular order and also how to sew straight seams. So I often start with my students on log cabin quilt squares. We do not make an entire quilt. Do not be scared. The goal is to make one quilt square that when completely finished would measure approximately 18 by 18. And then I often invite students to also put a back on it and create themselves a little throw pillow. So you can figure out cutting dimensions and learn a lot about how to use a ruler from creating something like this. If I were a quilter at home and I were doing this all the time, I would probably use a big cutting mat and a rotary cutter. However, again, this is a great exercise for beginning stitchers to learn how to cut and measure straight lines. So this is a math problem I like to solve early on with my students, get their brains into thinking about measurements and distinguishing between sewing measurements and cut measurements. So sewing measurements are the measurements that the garment or the piece will have when it's complete. The cutting measurements will be the measurements of the piece with seam allowance added. Seam allowance also must be included on every piece that you cut that you intend to sew. You have to leave extra room in which to sew on. You cannot sew on the very edge of raw fabrics. It doesn't work, it falls apart. So be conscious of an additional amount of fabric that you have to leave in there. So if our center square here, it measures 2 inches by 2 inches, we can figure out the dimensions of all the other rectangles that are involved in this quilt block square. For example, this is 2 by 2 in the center. The square next to it is also 2 by 2. And if we work our way clockwise around this quilt square, we can figure out all of the dimensions that would need to be cut. The rectangle underneath it is 2 by 4. This is also 2 by 4. Then if we jump up here and we've got 2 inches, 2 inches, 2 inches, that would be 2 by 6. And you'll see a pattern developing of 2 of the same measurement and it growing by 2 inches every time you jump to a new section. So eventually you can figure out all of your sewing dimensions. This would be 2 by 14. Make sure I'm doing this correctly for the camera. 2 by 16, 2 by 16, and then finally one long piece. You can see that this is the only piece that covers the entire length of the quilt square, and that's 2 by 18. Again, these are sewing dimensions, not cutting dimensions. So what do I mean by that? Well, if I were marking out a 2 by 2 square, I could use this lovely gridded ruler, and I'll flip it around to the other side so you can actually see the measurements on it. I could trace very easily a 2 by 2 square. And you can use the ruler to your advantage, which I strongly encourage, by seeing through the ruler, using its transparency to make your job easier. So manipulating and moving the ruler where you need it to be. So this would be 2 inches by 2 inches. That's the sewing dimensions, but like I said, we always need our cut dimensions to be larger. So my directions say use 1/2 inch seam allowance, and I recommend that because it's the easiest to do the math on and to find on my ruler. Many sewing patterns, commercial patterns, will give you a seam allowance of 5/8. That is a little bit trickier to find on your ruler and to do addition and subtraction. So I usually pick 1/2 inch or something else that is rounded at least to the nearest quarter. Now you can see this would be a piece with seam allowance around all of the sides. It measures 2 by 2 in the center and it will be sewn as 2 by 2, but it has an extra 1/2 inch all the way around the piece. And all of the pieces that I cut for this log cabin quilt square will also have 1/2 inch seam allowance. So if I think about it in that context, my actual cutting dimensions would be 3 inches by 3 inches for these center square pieces. For the 2 by 4 piece, it would actually be 3 inches by 5 inches. Each of these measurements will grow by 1 inch because they have a 1/2 inch seam allowance around all of their sides. You can also make it easier on yourself by using different sorts of rulers for the same task. You can see these gridded rulers are both effective and work for this purpose to mark out all the dimensions I need. This ruler right here is 2 inches by 18 inches long. It's divided down into 1/8 of an inch in a grid, and it's even got 1/16 on the edge if you need to be really specific with your measurements. It's very easy to draw out. So if I were creating these quilt pieces and I wanted to mark all of my sewing lines in addition to my cutting lines so that I have something to follow on the machine, I could use this 2 inch width to start creating pieces from. Or if I wish to just create the cutting dimensions and use the guide on the sewing machine itself, your sewing machine has little grooves on the throat plate that show you the different seam allowance widths away from your needle. You definitely can use those as well. So you could potentially cut an entire quilt square just like this with a 3 inch wide ruler, because you could be cutting your 3 inch width of pieces and then dividing your pieces into the lengths that you need, such as 3 inches, 5 inches, 7 inches, etc., as you get larger around. The other bit of advice that I have when getting started on a project like this is to create yourself a cutting list. So if the light side is side A and the dark side is side B, I could create a cutting list of all of the measurements that I need of that particular fabric. That way I know and I can check off as I go how many pieces I need of what color, and I can plan and arrange this. Organization is really important in sewing, so if you intend to do a lot of it, you could create yourself a little list of all the pieces that you would need, etc., and so on. So of the A side, I pretty much need one of every dimension, including the 18 inches. And in the B side, I would need one of every dimension, but not the one that is 18 inches. Also, sometimes in log cabin quilt squares, the center is a completely different color as well. So you could potentially use a third fabric there in the center to cut, and then the rest of the other colors. That's how to get started, or how to think about breaking down